Welcome all to the Worldline annual event, Rise India 2021. As part of this event, we are conducting this panel discussion. The topic of the discussion is how is regulation redefining the payments landscape in India? To understand this thing better, we have a esteemed set of panelists today available with us. We have Mr. Sailesh Paul, Vice President and Head, Merchant Sales and Acquiring and CyberSource, India and South Asia at Visa. We have Mr. Mahendra Dohare, General Manager FinTech, Credit Cards and Merchant Acquiring Business, Punjab National Bank. He has a rich experience of over 18 years in the banking industry. Then we have Mr. Ramakrishnan Ramamurthy, our own very face in Worldline, and he is the Executive Vice President, Service Delivery for Worldline's projects in India. We've seen over the last few months and years that there have been flurry of government announcements, there have been flurry of circulars, guidelines, which have been introduced by Reserve Bank of India. We start from the demonetization to PIDF. There have been enough and more. As we speak, there is almost an update almost like every week or so. So there is clearly a focus from the government and the regulator to have digitization as a foremost strategy for payments domain in India. With that in mind, we've seen a lot of ventures, a lot of rollouts which have been done over the period of so many years. To understand the current status is better, I would request Mr. Dohare to make us understand how these are currently taking shape here in India now.
Thank you, Ashish. With respect to, the tone is rightly set up by you. With respect to regulation in our nation, the regulator has taken a very right step since primarily since a couple of years, last 1 or 2 years, and basically the purpose seems to be very rightly the empowerment of the customers and end users, we can say. So whatever the steps have been taken, what are the regulations have been brought in to the various circulars and guidelines, so you will find out that ultimately it is the end user who is going to be benefited in terms of services, in terms of outreach, in terms of security concerns, in terms of data privacy also. So if we see that, for example, India stack is one of the major, this thing brought in by the regulator or the country is witnessing. Then you see that from RBI, the opportunity is given to the fintechs or startups in terms of sandbox testing. Then you see then the role played by the NPCI and the UIDAI and the various kind of measures brought in, like relaxed KYC norms. Video KYC has come in, which is now being going to be opened for the NBFCs or different players in the market. And then you see that, from the government side also a lot of measures like under the JAM Trinity. All these measures are so getting interconnected that we are seeing a lot of, scaling up, lot of market players coming up in the market. And we are seeing a lot of new kind of innovations, new kind of technologies, which the regulators are supporting. But at the same time, if you see, with these kind of, the market is getting open, there are some kind of regulations coming up, which may disrupt also. Disruption in the sense, ultimately it will bring something good for the consumers, for the serious players in the market, like payment security control standards have been brought in. And for example, you have also pointed out in your paper that for account aggregator and licensing has been brought in with slew of measures which they have to comply. Then data storage is also one of the important issues. Then data localization as an issue. So all these, the kind of regulation has been brought in. Ultimately, this will empower the customers and users, and it will make the ecosystem a very robust and resilient. This is from my side.
Thanks, Mr. Dohare. And I fully understand when you're saying the customer is at as at the center, and all the changes, whatever have been made, are keeping primary, customer at the center. Salish, what is your thought about it? At how we are currently shaping up?
I think it's been a very, very interesting journey, particularly so in the last 4 or 5 years, where India's leapfrogged on the innovation scale. But if you think about it from the top down, India's vision of making a digital India, that's really inspired all of the agencies, including the RBI, that have enabled the policies that facilitate innovation. And Mr. Dohare pointed out one of the examples, the regulatory sandbox. There's been a number of measures that the RBI has introduced to the industry that have been actually quite wholeheartedly accepted, right? Be it the regulatory sandbox, the innovation hub, setting up and co-funding the Payment Infrastructure Development Fund, which is a big step forward. The moves that are being made on CBDC as we move towards a central bank digital currency, these are all big steps forward. If you think about the opportunity that India has for digitization, it's probably amongst the most significant in the world. And if you look at India's consumption expenditure, we're still one of the largest users of cash in the world. And that is both a problem because it slows down commerce, and it's an opportunity for us to innovate so we can gradually digitize commerce and digitize customers' daily lives. And that's what I think everyone is focused on. That's the big prize. So if you look at the $1 trillion+ of cash that we have in the Indian economy, there are a number of strong trends that are moving forward, eating into cash. So now, we're 18 to 20% digitized as it relates to PCE, private consumption expenditure. The growth of the locally grown payments infrastructure has been phenomenal. So now with UPI making big steps forward, all of the card systems have grown, and now there's more innovation that is coming in through the fintechs. That is getting enabled by a favorable policy platform, if you like, or a policy framework that allows these players to come in. Now, to the extent that there are controls and there are stage gate ways of participating, that's a good thing. If you have a good new concept, you can join one of the sandbox cohorts. You can test that, and then you go from there, right? The RBI has encouraged the testing of, let's say, offline payments. It's being done in a small way, but that could scale up and potentially solve the problems of some remote areas. So I think it's being done in a fairly measured way as well. I think what really matters for us in the long run is if we can create an open, interoperable payments ecosystem, then that will allow more new players to come in. They will allow the innovation, while the stable legacy players like the banks, the networks, will provide the safety, the security, and the resilience to that payments ecosystem. And that collaboration of new players and legacy players, we think will actually provide the railroads for even more innovation in the future.
Thanks, Alish. I think so. One of the points when you talked about the new payment systems, we may have one of the points later for discussion. Maybe that can further be elaborated a little later. Maybe Rama, maybe your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think we've had very good perspectives coming in from Mahindra and Shailesh. But if I were to look at it and why we are heading towards where we are heading, I think it's important to put the macro in perspective. If you have to look at India where we were maybe about not even a decade back, about 5-7 years back, when we were driving the financial inclusion program, and the way it was driven to make it optimum for the last mile guy to come on board onto the banking ecosystem. That's been a huge plus. But now having got there, the next important thing for us is to see how do we enable all of these customers, including the digitally abled ones, into the ecosystem into a common framework. That throws up a significant challenge in terms of a wide variety of diversity that we have in India. If you look at the demographic diversity in India, typically the urban versus rural, there are very different ecosystems that need to be managed. So there is the challenge about how do you get the guy on the ground who's maybe not financially literate, not even educated, not literate. So how do you get him into a digital ecosystem? And there, that means that you need to have a different program and a framework to manage that. As against that, how do you manage e-commerce, which needs to digitally progress at a much faster pace, so that we can look at the other end of the spectrum to say how do you formatively grow at a much higher growth rate. Like Sailesh rightly said, India is still a high percentage of cash as an economy. So the drivers have to be at multiple steps, and when you have to look at uh, so many parts to the engine that needs to work coherently, I think there needs to be a strong governing framework which can manage all of this. That has to essentially take care of two fundamental things. One is the standardization and the operability is taken care of well. The risks are well captured and understood in terms of how it needs to operate. And the third part is to create an open framework for people to come into this ecosystem, innovate, and take it to the ecosystem. So, like you said, you have a sandbox or guys who might want to come and innovate on what you might want to do in the last mile. So, is there something more that you can do on biometrics and maybe some more things in terms of just say tone tag or voice tag that's being looked at today, and that's what was needed to kind of take the ecosystem forward. This is just the beginning, like we rightly heard in the forum as well. India is at the cusp of the digital transformation. So we are just seeing the beginning of the regulations. We are not done yet. I think there is a lot more that will also come in as we progress along, and I'm sure we'll see more diversities coming in, more learnings coming in, and I'm sure the framework that is being put together by the government in terms of either you look at the Digital India Initiative or RBI focusing its lens on both sides in terms of how strong can the governance be. At the same time, how can you promote innovation? I think in that, if you have to look at that together, I think we are at in the right direction and moving towards the right path to significantly grow in our digital initiative.
Thanks, Rama. Mr. Dohare, I mean, while we got a lot of insights from all three of you, what I understand is that government has paved the way or laid the rails so that the objective, what they've set, can be met. And while those rails or those roads have been paved, uh, we know, as what even Rama mentioned, that from the challenge is reaching the last mile, or completing the last mile, or the person who is supposed to receive that benefit or is supposed to consume that benefit. So, what do you see today currently as uh, efforts, or could there be some kind of entities which can be introduced who could really take up that role, bridge that gap between the measures which have been laid down and to the final consumer?
See, with respect to untapped market or the locations where yet to be, I mean, this digital payment ecosystem is yet to be developed fully, like metros. Particularly, if you see the rural areas or tier 5 to 6 cities or northeastern states, for these kind of states, earlier we used to talk about financial literacy. Now we are talking about digital literacy, and a lot of efforts are being undertaken by the government also and the regulator also. Like now the DBTs are seamless, and now all the this ecosystem of PFMS is developed in such a manner that it is ultimate seamless and very seamless. The fund flow is very seamless, and the errors are very less. It is getting developed also, and a lot of initiatives are taken under this segment, under PFMS also by the government to scale it up. That work is undergoing at various levels. Secondly, if we see like from the regulator side also, like you have also included a point, PID, Payment Infrastructure Development Fund. There, the scorecard is more towards the digital payment infrastructure development. with more like QR codes rather than the physical POS. And under these also, I mean, a lot of support is being given by the state government also. A lot of camps are being held. And if you see the BC system also, banking correspondence or this CSC network also, there also a lot of digitization and digital related work is being undertaken. So all these are getting aligned at the this for the people at the bottom of pyramid, and through these channels, digital channels, a lot of micro insurance, a lot of micro mutual funds kind of schemes are being launched by the different players in the market. At the same time, apart from the major players under the banks or major FIs or RRBs, now there we are finding the lot of agri-techs and fintechs are taking the initiative, and for these segments to come up with some innovative kind of solutions. So gradually we may see a lot of collaboration among the FI financial institutions and these fintechs and startups for these people at the bottom of pyramid. And the another major point is maybe in a short, maybe after some time, we will see the license given for a new umbrella entity. And there also, one of the major point of the regulator was they should develop the products which will cater to the needs of the people at the at these locations based on the based on their demographics, based on the geographical location, because there is a lot of opportunity for large volume and small value payments. So definitely going forward, we may see a lot of developments for these kind of geographies and the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johari. Salish, so as I understood from Mr. Johari's opinion about those digital channels, they seem to be working well, whether it is business correspondence or the customer service centers, which are extension of that railroad to reach the final end customer. What is your thought process in that? Will there be, or should you suggest, can there be some refinements in the system? Can there be new entities which could be introduced to make it more efficient, maybe faster, with maybe some kind of an incentivization? Uh, do you think so? Something of that sort still there is a scope to improve on that?
Yes, Ashish, absolutely. And you're right, there are several aspects that need to be tackled, some of which are already being tackled. Firstly, if you just step back, the reason we don't have payments infrastructure across all of our small towns and cities, there's a multitude of factors to understand. Cost becomes one of the challenges. Mm-hmm. Access to technology becomes one of the challenges. And the familiarity or the education of utilizing all of these infrastructure also becomes a challenge, right? Let's take each of these one at a time. Firstly, let's talk about cost. Today, there is an infrastructure that requires a POS to be deployed when you want to use your debit card in a tier 5 or tier 6 city or in a rural center. That cost by itself had been prohibitive for a very long time. Two things have happened. One is the cost of those devices has been gradually coming down, right? Now, newer types of devices can be used to do the same thing. So, for example, an NFC-ready mobile phone can now become a POS by itself. It can present you a QR code. It can accept a card through NFC, and increasingly more and more cards are becoming NFC capable. You can send out a link for a payment. So there's a number of things that can now be done with a device that possibly the shopkeeper already had. So that's a good sort of solution that where the cost of the product is coming down. Now India has close to 1 billion cards. We shouldn't waste the opportunity of that fantastic number of cards that have been set up, right? Over 900 million debit cards are in circulation. Getting the POS out is still an important aspect because not everyone has a smartphone to scan a QR. So you need the set of POS solutions, you need the set of QR solutions. So people can either scan or they can tap a card or whatever. And the RBI has done very well to create a subsidy mechanism through the PIDF where the networks, the banks, and the RBI itself are contributing a significant amount of money. I have the privilege of being on the advisory council at PIDF, and I can tell you that there's a lot of attention to making sure that the subsidy gets out, gets utilized, and in fact, everyone at the RBI is talking about how do you now, plan for the next phase. So that's been fantastic. The second aspect that I had talked about was access to technology. So connectivity is an important aspect. Access to the internet, access to electricity, access to just the basic technology. And even then, there's some amount of innovation that's happening to say, how do you address locations that are in a mountainous region and there are shadows of internet coverage? Can there be some innovation that can be done for that? So I mentioned the offline payments pilot. Can there be other types of acceptance that can come up? So that's around access to technology. And we know through the pandemic that those that have access to technology, finance, and logistics have done well. Those that don't have suffered. And hence the small and the MSME has suffered in the pandemic while the large technology giants have done well. The last piece is education, right? Both customers and sellers, both buyers and sellers need to understand that this is a good thing for business. And then once they do, that's when the market will move forward, because then there'll be more rapid adoption of both current and future infrastructure.
Thanks, Salish. Rama, your two thoughts about this?
So I'll maybe take off from where Mr. Mahendra and Shailesh have mentioned. I think they're very clearly articulated and well articulated in terms of what the baselines are. Maybe you mentioned the point about, is there an opportunity to innovate, or is there a need to create an ecosystem which can kind of carry forward all of these initiatives? So I'm saying, if you have to look at the baseline of what is essentially needed for successful commerce, right? You need a customer on one side, and if you have to look at digital commerce specifically, you need a customer on one side, and we have that in plenty in India. We don't have to worry about the number of people that we have. We don't need to worry about them now being enabled for banking. They are already enabled. Most of these accounts are issued for cards. So we have an instrument also available to enable them or to digitally transact. So essentially, the baseline for conducting commerce is there. The other, if you have to look at then, how do you make this commerce available? Is where the government and industry partnerships come in, and there are so many initiatives that have been taken to take it to the last mile. Whether it's in terms of creating, say, BQR as an example, or just offline QR as an example. You can take it down to the last mile. You see that in a vegetable vendor on the roadside today, if you go to Tier 1, Tier 2, is that replicable? Of course, it is replicable. Has that scaled currently in Tier 1, Tier 2? Oh, it's an extremely profitable business model, and there are many people who have gone and set up business lines only using this one use case, right? So it's a question of now connected commerce and how do we build various use cases to kind of take it down to the ground. There is enough that has been done to create the rails, and the good thing about the whole rails, and when we talk about rails, I think it's very important to kind of bring this perspective in as well. Though we might be a very diverse country with so many payment options, maybe we might have the widest coverage in terms of payment options that could service the various needs of the consumer. But if you look at the settlement and the clearing rails, which is at the end of the day how the money moves, we have one of the most robust and efficient payment systems, which is all centralized and which is either real time or close to real time now. Practically every payment option that is there. So money movement is not a challenge, in spite of the diversity that we have on the ground. With all of this put together, I think there is room for many more players to come in, look at small use cases, or take the existing use cases that have already created enough commercial successes in the Tier 1, Tier 2, and replicate them into the interior pockets of the country. So I think we have the ecosystem that is now created and laid. It's a question of how do we kind of create opportunities for success out of what we have.
Thank you, Rama. We discussed about PIDF also, and great to know that Salish has been part of the advisory board. And from a PIDF perspective, while there is a staggered rollout of how it should be rolled out, funds have been put in So what are the typical challenges and how are those currently addressed? I would request Sailesh first to uh, maybe add on this because he would be very privy to how this is getting really implemented.
And Ashish, just to be clear, when you say challenges, you mean of deployment and expansion, or at the PID level?
Yeah, at the deployment part of it.
Correct. So, so firstly, if you look at the construct of the PIDF, there is an incentive structure that provides a relief to whoever deploys acceptance infrastructure, and it's a tiered method, right? If you're deploying acceptance in the smaller cities, then that's a good thing. You get a better share of the incentives. It's also to an extent related to the cost of deployment. So a POS is much more expensive to deploy, and hence you get a better incentive for the POS versus a QR. So there is a mechanism that's in place. There's a process that's in place, and the industry is very much utilizing that. But let's talk a little bit more about what's actually happening in the market as such, right? So just for context, India's acceptance infrastructure for at least the cards ecosystem is substantially behind that of other countries, right? We have about 500 acceptance points per 1 lakh population. If you look at a China or a Russia or a South Africa, that's 5 to 8 times more. So we're trying to catch up, right? While we have a very good population of cards, we don't have as much payment acceptance infrastructure. Hence, the opportunity to pay for a customer is lower, right? To Rama's point, that's going to drive the usage. So the way that it's being done is that this is a scheme that's now available to everyone who's a participant in the seller side ecosystem. It's available to banks. So if Punjab National Bank wanted to go out and deploy a rapid expansion of POS, then the PIDF steps in to make that economically more viable for the bank. In the same way, if somebody like a Worldline were to try and do that, then that becomes more viable because then they can either, in a combination of coming through the banks that you work with, or otherwise they can leverage that interest, that incentive structure. So I think that part of it is solved. I think what needs to happen a lot more is that the word needs to get out there where more of the last mile of the deployment happens. So, for example, at Visa, we have now started working very actively with smaller fintechs. We work very actively with a lot of the big tech players because what we found is that there's a lot of interest in technology with technology based companies that can sometimes do the job that we're trying to do in an effective manner and in a much faster manner. So, for what we're trying to do, for example, is to actually just widen the set of partnerships that then sort of join the formal ecosystem of banks and payment networks. And that's when we get the acceleration. So, a lot of these fintechs, we might support them in initiatives, but that fintech will eventually come to a bank acquirer. So they might connect to a bank like Mr. Harris, where they become the principal that brings them into the payment ecosystem. And that creates that innovation and creates that nimbleness. Also at Visa, we're trying to open up the edges of the network, but with enough controls and security. So we can bring the innovation that these players bring with the stability and the security that players like ourselves bring. And that's what we think will sort of expand the ecosystem. So I think we're in a good place. There's a lot of fintech emerging. Payments is probably use case number one for fintechs, the other being lending. So there's a lot of interest from innovators. And I think the ecosystem is open enough that allows all of this to thrive. So from that perspective, if we had to look forward, I think there's a very exciting set of next years ahead of us.
Great. Really nice to know that, Saresh. Mr. Dohari, from a bank's perspective and being one of the largest banks, I believe your involvement as a bank would be very, very prime when it comes to PIDF. So how do you see overcoming any kind of challenges when it comes to deployment or rollout of this program to the tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, and tier 6 cities?
See, of course, there are challenges. The biggest challenge all of us know that MDR is one of the biggest challenge for the banks. So, this business itself is not very lucrative now after once the MDR has done away with the government. The second challenge is connectivity is another challenge in the remotest area, particularly in the northeast. And now what we are witnessing that gradually, I mean, in the these places also, northeast or tier 5, tier 6 cities, people are now well digitally. They are well aware. They have most of them have smartphones. Now the population is moving toward the soft pause rather than the physical pause devices. So, I mean, these are the challenges, but of course, the smaller merchants they are accepting this physical POS devices at the same time this QR codes also. But the kind of digital literacy, the kind of I mean, there has to be interlinkages. It's not only the POS devices. There should be a lot of many other kind of channels or services so that our ecosystem in these places is created. I mean, if we see the like some of the villages where I have personally seen, there are only 3, 4 shops, and in a village, and I mean, if you install the POS machine, there won't be any transactions, and they are very comfortable with the cash. So these kind of challenges are still there. So I mean, simply installing the POS is not going to resolve the issue. Some kind of other linkages, some kind of gradual shift towards the cashless to some like the another challenge is many at these places feature phone. They have the feature phone. Not everybody has a smartphone. If you can develop something on the feature phone, some of the services which can link to the POS or something like that, these things are yet to come up. That's why,
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise, POS is such a good mechanism that automatically it should have come up rather than the regulator or the government from the government side giving a push. But still, challenges are there. Maybe gradually we'll see a shift towards cashless society through the POS or digital POS or the QR codes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dwale.
Ashish, if I
Some of,
could just add on to that, I
please,
think Mr.
sure.
Dohare touched on a really important point. Just building on what you said,
Yeah.
there is an accompanying ecosystem that needs to develop around it, right? To your point, you can't just only have payments because payments is one part of the ecosystem. So, so part of what will help us grow is when digital payments leads to other good consequences. So for a merchant, if I can accept more of my payments digitally, then I have a record of my payments. That means then I can demonstrate my cash flow to a bank and go and procure a loan. Right. So there is that additional value added services or access to other financial services that payments enables. That by itself is also another really important step forward. So that's just one example of where a merchant that is accepting payments digitally then gets the benefit of that by, let's say, access to credit. We need to have more and more of such innovations. When that ecosystem comes together, then the resistance or the inertia that you talked about, Mr. Duhare, that will start crumbling a little bit. And I think that will help us tremendously. Sorry, I just wanted to add on. I think you made a good point there.
Yeah, absolutely, Sailesh, and I think so. Very well said. Sorry, Mr. Dohare, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, yeah. Sailesh ji has rightly pointed out there could be some other kind of services like on the POS we have EMI on POS, but that may not work out for the rural customers. Okay, so if we can have something related to farm activity, something related to agriculture where they can avail those services
Yeah.
over the POS itself, those kind of linkages are yet to be developed. So these
Very good.
specific services or a specific kind of offering has to be given on these POS machines or the digital or physical devices. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess what both of you mentioned is very, very important for sort of incentivizing the person who is wanting to collect digitally. I mean, because he's in such kind of an ecosystem wherein if any financial product which he's wanting to consume can also be brought onto that particular platform. I think so. What even Shailesh did make a mention of that he is possibly a farmer's son who is running a shop somewhere, and maybe his father needs a loan, and maybe along with he trying to promote digitization at his shop, if there is some kind of a product which is available which will cater to his so his father currently consumes some kind of a financial product, maybe from a local market there, maybe a lender, maybe a landlord somewhere who would be paying him and charging heavy interest rates. Maybe such kind of banking products are made available on the same infrastructure. I think so that can incentivize them to actually promote digital transactions from the consumer's end to make a payment to him. I think it's a very, very important point made said. One point also, what I could understand from both of your discussion is involvement of more fintechs. I think so is definitely one of the ways to go ahead. But Rama, with the limited availability of incentivization in this entire transaction, what Mr. Dohare also pointed out is MDR is a concern, and with MDR being a concern, uh, having more fintechs, having more participants in this entire ecosystem, uh, will it how will it help, or could that pose some kind of a further challenge on how does one make money out of it?
Essentially, I think if you have to look at enabling, and I like what Shailesh said. It is not about just digital payments. How do we enable that entire ecosystem to be functional digitally? Is, I think, the core question that needs to be answered. And how do we create an ecosystem which can manage that? Purely from a payments perspective, I think there is enough that has been done to manage sustenance and continuity, whether it's in terms of subsidizing the infrastructure that needs to be created for payment acceptance, or to a limited extent, even the cost of payments, say UPI and cards for small value transactions are still significantly subsidized. Of course, it's not all the payment options, and there is some road to travel there. But there is at least a baseline available to start with payment acceptance. But having said that, how do you bring this ecosystem together to transact? I think that's what is more important. So if I have to take a simple example, I'm saying you're in a remote village, essentially dealing with an ecosystem of farmers. What if you are a fintech and you can create a platform where you are able to connect, say, the mandi where he's going to supply his commodity, where he's going to sell it. What if we had to connect, say, the PDS, the public distribution system, from where he's going to be buying his day-to-day needs? What if we had to connect the healthcare ecosystem around that area together? And what if we had to connect even the retailers who are around that area who are selling the daily stuff that needs to be there? The small-time kirana shop, maybe 2 or 3 of them. But only if you can bring this ecosystem together and get that person to transact in each one of these phases. Is first the payments program going to start. But once that program starts, what you have is multiple data points across the other ecosystem. Say if he's going to transact on a Monday, you have enough view in terms of what's the cash flow that he has, and that in itself will enable lending there. That also gives a quick view from a PMS perspective to somebody to put in a savings program together along with it. I think that's the ecosystem that needs to develop. I don't think this can work in isolation. It's an important step to create the payment acceptance point, but it's also important to bring the rest of the ecosystem together so that there is a binding reason for the consumer to come on board. I think that's where I think fintechs and can play a role. That's where a lot of other the PA business or the aggregator business, not limited to just payments, can come together and bring this ecosystem on board to the digitalization. That's
Thanks, Rama. Over the last, I guess, couple of years, and especially over the last few months, there have been a lot of circulars, updates, which have been coming from the regulator pertaining to card on file tokenization, SI on cards. There have been some timelines which had been defined earlier. They got a little extended to accommodate more participants, to accommodate maybe whatever changes in the systems which people would want to or entities would want to do in that. The recent update which has happened from a tokenization perspective is on inclusion of issuers as a part of who could offer tokenization services. So, Sailesh, how do you see this change? What kind of a dynamics does it really bring into the ecosystem? Because prior to this, it were only the card schemes who were sort of envisaged to provide tokenization service.
Sure. Firstly, let me start by saying that tokenization is an important step forward. What the RBI is trying to do over here, or at least this is how we understand it, is that they want to control, or they want to make sure that the ecosystem that has access to vital financial information is that part of the ecosystem that is regulated, has regulatory oversight, and it conforms to certain minimum criteria. Right now, for us to move cards out of the merchant ecosystem, you still have to have some way for these merchants to initiate a payment that a customer is authorized. Tokenization enables that to happen. And with tokenization, now what you've got is you've got a PAN, which is now replaced by a token, which is substantially more secure by design. So that's the right outcome as it relates to customers. And it's a good outcome as it relates to merchants because now their success rates will also improve. Their assurance of payments will also improve. The challenge that the industry is now grappling with is how to get this done with a minimum amount of customer friction and with adherence to the aggressive timelines that we've been set for it. So the challenge is not so much, what's the right solution and how will we do it? The challenge is how can we do it quickly enough without disrupting commerce? And that's what everyone's focused on. The fact that issuers are also now permitted to offer the tokenization service, that's a good move. I mean, if you have more than one type of player that has the ability to provide a globally known solution, then that's not a bad thing at all. It also places some requirements on whoever is the token service provider. So the RBI has been also fairly clear around a lot of the service and compliance requirements that they've placed on the token service providers. So, going forward, if there is a number of issuers and, of course, the networks that provide the service, then that's great because now there's more access to tokenization for the entire market.
Thanks, Salish. Mr. Dohare, from banks or issuers perspective, being one of the largest banks, again, both on the debit cards and, of course, on the credit card side. So what is your view and opinion about this change? Do you see it as an additional opportunity for issuer banks to also have more honest arrangements, if that is one of the possible thoughts which also comes into the picture? So how do you see it?
Oh, I see that this is a good move by the regulator because since you would also be seeing in the market that a lot of frauds are happening over the card data, and tokenization is the well thought move so that customer data is protected, frauds are reduced, and definitely there are challenges for implementation. A lot of inconvenience to the customer will happen, inconvenience to the the ecosystem will happen, but ultimately we have to do it, and ultimately it's going to help the banks and the ecosystem only. And this customer will be the best. He will be getting the benefit out of it. So there is no challenge as it. And recently, RBI has included some other gadgets also under that, so that, and maybe gradually it will evolve more in the sense that it will be seamless ultimately. So we see challenges, but we have to meet the deadline as a bank. So we are working on it. So I think this is a good move by the regulator.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dohare. Rama, from a payment aggregator perspective, we know what has happened, what are the changes we need to do. How do you see a payment aggregator making the best use of this new inclusion with the issuers also coming into the picture?
So first and foremost, like you said, tokenization is an important step and a step in the right direction. With the expansion of digital payments happening at this point in time, the card on file is practically there with everybody in the ecosystem and every chain in the ecosystem. So, and then with that, governance and standardization really becomes difficult. We have seen quite a few incidents in the recent past. One is in terms of the high influx of frauds and compromises and even on data breaches happening. It is imperative that you bring a closed system or maybe a controllable system in place which can tackle the problem statement. Of course, there is an immediate impact, like for aggregators like us or for people like us who offer experience-based checkout programs to the various merchants. There is maybe a short-term impact in terms of how the drive towards even digital programs, and there are ecosystems that, at least typically if you look at significantly the e-commerce and the travel industry, where there is a very high focus on customer experience as far as the payments program is concerned. There is going to be some remediation that will have to be done towards that there is going to be some short-term impact. But like Sailesh rightly said, step in the right direction. I don't think we've seen the last of it. The issuers coming into the fold makes a big difference to us. With most of the aggregators like us, we have practically rails to most of the larger banking players in the ecosystem today, and that kind of creates definitely an opportunity to work with a different product and solution, and in fact creates a wider horizon in terms of how the tokenization can be managed with the schemes and the issuers both being there together. And that kind of creates some room for us to innovate and then work on this program a little differently. But I guess very early stages, I don't think we have seen or heard the last on this. A step to begin with, I think there is a lot to be done as we move along, and I'm sure there will be learnings that will be there as we go along. And I'm sure if we can work on the learnings and put together a more comprehensive program, we will be in a better shape in time to come.
Thanks, Rama. Sarish, do you see any new entities? May not be immediately because the circular has just come maybe a few weeks back. Maybe a few more entities beyond issuers could also get some role to play. Maybe in the next few months' time, do you see something of that sort happening?
I don't want to second guess any policy on this, but even with the policy framework that's already been put in place, what's happened is tokenization has been permitted for a couple of years now. Firstly, it was permitted device-based tokenization for mobiles and tablets. Then in August, the RBI permitted the Internet of Things and other devices. And then on the 7th of September, they permitted the card and file use case, which the industry had been appealing for, by the way. So that's the most prevalent use case, right? So firstly, as it relates to the use cases, that is expanding, which now means that more and more players can be beneficiaries of tokenization. The most obviously, it'll start with the merchants, the payment aggregators, the banks. Can there be new players that enter into the fray? Possibly. There could be new service providers that form the intermediary between a merchant and a network, or a merchant and the issuer. But it has its own set of criteria, right? They have to comply with certain norms. Yeah. So it's possible that more entrants might come into that service layer that end up being token requesters on behalf of a merchant. And there's a number of payment aggregators that potentially will consider entering that part of this value chain. Tokenization by itself is a complex task. It requires a very high level of security. It requires a complex technology. So I think the number of token service providers as such, we will see a gradual increase in that. And my expectation is that as the issuers think about it, some of them will decide to enter. And those will be the ones that have access to, technology and they want to make the investments. So I think I don't expect that there'll be a rush of new players to offer token services as such. I think this is going to be a service that will be offered by the largest banks and the payment networks.
Thanks, Sailesh. One of the things which has been doing rounds again for the last couple of years is on the PAPG license, and we as Worldline have been, uh, you know, very. I mean, we are the ones who are also supposed to be one of the payment aggregators. So what we also see is there are certain criterias which have been put by Reserve Bank of India in terms of who all with what all capabilities can really qualify as a payment aggregator. Rama, from a perspective of these limitations, if I were to use that word, do you see that this industry will in some way allow only a certain uh, capable institutions, of course, for sure, but maybe it may prohibit innovation, new entrants coming into the fray, and adding some dash of freshness into the system.
Well, we don't see it that way, frankly. So I'm saying if you have to take this into maybe two or three parts, the first part in terms of why the licensing and is it the right thing to do? I think payment aggregators, the PAPG business has become significantly large and is a systemic, it got to a systemic level. So of course, uh, a central governance is absolutely imperative. So towards that extent, the PAPG guideline creates a good standard framework in terms of who should be there, how should you govern, how should you run, what's the mitigations that you need to have, what are the procedural programs that you need to have in place to run your business operations. So I think that is very, very important to kind of create the right framework of governance and control as we move along this journey. So towards that extent, I think the licensing program is the right step. No questions about it. As we go along and understanding and appreciating the philosophy of the central bank of RBI, saying that if you're becoming a systemic player uh, and you're handling funds, and that in itself requires you to have financial stability at the very minimal. So to create a net worth criteria is nothing wrong, but does that become a deterrent for others to enter it? Does the various technology security features that you need to have in place, the strong risk governance practices that you need to put in place, whether it's KYC, AML, or transaction monitoring, which we're left with the respective entities to kind of currently take care of. That's creating a standardized framework in terms of how it needs to be governed overall. I think that's also much needed and welcome, so that you have a common ground to kind of assess everybody, which is again the right way forward. But does that in any way prohibit inhibitions or prohibit the innovations that will happen in payments? I don't think so. There is, of course, if any of the innovators today or the new fintechs and startups coming into the play are not able to justify all the criteria on their own, there is, of course, a partnership play very much available. That's not something that's been put behind. That's one approach that everybody is very actively pursuing. If not, and if you don't want to be a PAPG in its entirety, there is nothing which stops any of the innovators from just being product and solutions players who can be the suppliers for the innovation ground to a lot of these entities. So I think from a scale and efficiency perspective, the right way forward for the innovation, I think there are enough structures and frameworks available for it to be fostered, and I don't think this will be a limitation in any case.
Thanks, Sarma. I think so. Very, very valuable perspective, and I hope this panel discussion goes to all those fintechs who would be wanting to dive into the space, and I think so it's a good guidance for them. Thank you, Rama, on that. One of the points what we discussed and touched upon very, very briefly today is on the new umbrella entity. And while we could understand in our discussion earlier that it seems that it is imperative and it is good possibly to have the concept of new umbrella entities coming into the picture. I believe, of course, there will be certain amount of consolidation happening, even if, let's say, there would be quite a few entries into the fray. How will it really help digitization as an objective? Is what I wanted to also understand. And maybe Rama, you could possibly give your insights into that.
So if I understood it right, you're looking at what are we looking at from a digitization perspective? True. Okay. So there are a couple of pivots, and some of them we discussed in terms of what we spoke about the Digital India initiative in terms of how digitization is being taken as an overall country framework to be taken down to the ground. That's got multiple pillars of support in terms of digitization, not limited to just payments, but of course across the ecosystem, and in terms of the India stack that is there, in terms of the various payment options that have been enabled, keeping in mind the various demographies and divides that we have in India. I think one of the other new initiatives that is coming in place, which is very relevant to talk about here, is about NUE, and I think that's an important perspective to also understand as to why what is the relevance of a NUE and why it is maybe also an important direction. India is going to be a humongously large retail payments ecosystem. There is a need for that ecosystem from a central infrastructure point of view to be very robust, very resilient, to be very resilient towards security and frauds as a framework. To create an alternate to that as an NUE is an important direction and the right way forward. One, it is going to create a lot of competitiveness between the players, and that's important. And second thing is it's also going to bring in a set of more and newer payment options, which I think the larger ecosystem can look at, assess, and then go forward basis the comfort. They are not just left to what is available to look at. I think that's going to be another important aspect that will drive the digitization in the country. So that's where my thoughts are in terms of what next on digitization, how maybe say NUE as an example is going to be help promote the programs.
Mr. Dohare, from a new umbrella entity perspective and the objective which it is supposed to be, worked out for, and with maybe many players interested in that fray. So how do you see that? Because not many of the times people have been saying that it will lead to creation of multiple NPCIs in India, which may be privately owned. So is that true, or will there be too much of chaos having too many umbrella entities? How do you see it coming?
No, what I see that it won't be creating any kiosk, and it may not be a parallel to NPCI also, because what is happening in the market, actually the development in the ecosystem with respect to financial technologies or product and services is happening on their own. The regulator is providing a framework or the guidelines or the circular has been issued, but we need some big players to come into the picture, those who has the capacity, technology, investment, capital, or they can collaborate with the another big players outside the country and bring in the technologies which are not available in the market. They would have a capacity and capital to invest in the new kind of technologies. They can take the risk also. So those kind of setup, that kind of framework under new umbrella entity will definitely, from my personal view, will be a landmark milestone for the country if it, goes to a success. So, and whatever is happening, still there is a lot of scope. Like under blockchain, we are not able to do so much in the country. Under this AI, robotics, machine learning, there are a lot of areas where the development can happen. And rather than focusing on one entity, if there is another entity or two, three more entities which will work on this, definitely we will see a lot of disruption, which will ultimately take the country towards more digitalization, cost reductions, and the development. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deore. Salish, we have less time left, so maybe your 2 cents on that.
Sure. Very quickly, I think we have to counterbalance two things, right? On the one hand, what is the stated objective from the RBI's perspective as well. You need stability of the system, you need security, you need customer protection. On the other hand, is the need for innovation, for enabling new use cases to reduce cost and to increase the value, right? Any mechanism that enables new competition for new players to come in and coming in a way that satisfies a set of participation criteria, in our view, is a good move. So, we're very supportive of this in the framework that is laid out right now, or if there's any new sort of evolution of that framework, we think it's a positive step for the ecosystem to get good, new, stable participation.
Thanks so much, Ashish. So, as I believe, basis our discussions today, we see that there is definitely an objective, there is an intent, there is participation, the rails are there. While there are some challenges we see, but then, of course, those challenges with the kind of inputs what we have understood, I'm sure those are definitely the ones which can be overcome. And we are looking at a very, very progressive digitization in India. Some people do also talk about, the digitization which India is currently undergoing is also not there in some of the very, very developed nations. And that's very, very heartening to know. But I guess apart from that, whatever we have discussed, I think so it's been a very, very enriching session. And I would like to really thank you, all of you. Thanks, Mr. Dohare. Thanks, Sailesh. Thanks, Rama, for all your inputs and experience and knowledge about all these topics. Thank you very much.